Five Nights at Freddy's is a series that at this point you couldn't avoid if you tried. Over the past decade, if you haven't seen this guy's fuzzy face and bow tie, you must have been in a coma. And I deeply apologize for being the first one to ask you, was that the bite of 87? Sorry, I had to. But seriously, I have been lucky enough to have been following this video game franchise and its lore since the beginning. What was once a beloved indie darling has transformed into a series full of inside jokes, buffoonery, way too goddamn many Freddy variants, and nonsensical lore with more questions than answers. Let's talk about how context killed Five Nights at Freddy's. The first game, which I will now refer to as Fnaf, was released in August of 2014 by Scott Cawthon, the sole developer and the real man behind the slaughter. Lore. The man behind the slaughter lore. The game itself was a simple point-and-click survival horror, with a single panning camera and a few mechanics that only the most dedicated players would take advantage of in order to complete 420 mode. No, not that 420, this one. A secret 8th night after the secret 7th and 6th nights, where you could manipulate the intelligence of each character's AI. Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy. Of course, there was a 5th animatronic, aptly named Golden Freddy, but he was a rare encounter who was best known for crashing your game. The game made huge strides thanks to YouTube, it being the perfect format for Let's Play YouTubers. The jump scares allowed for dramatic reactions, but the levels weren't so long that the watch time felt like it was being dragged on just for the purpose of advertisements. It was a content machine. Naturally, following its success, Scott made a sequel. Prequel, actually, but don't worry, because he made a sequel too. A couple, actually. Yeah, Scott had a taste of success and he was not letting it go. And he was fast, too. In the first year, laying down the groundwork for the rest of the franchise with the base 4 games. Fnaf 2 introduced the toy animatronics and the withered animatronics, while Fnaf 3 put you up against the iconic, although not so scary, Springtrap, and the Phantoms. Fnaf 4 gave us the nightmare animatronics. But there's a major part of these games that we obviously have to talk about. Okay, I may have alluded to it a bit. The lore of this game really drew a lot of people's interest, which is even more fascinating when you consider that the first game only had a few hints about what was going on below the surface, besides Phone Guy's ominous voice messages.
The animatronic characters here do get a bit quirky at night.
And the pay stub you receive at the end of the week. The only way that the player could read into the story of the game was through newspaper clippings found on different walls of the pizzeria when you looked through the cams. These papers told the player about a man who lured 5 children into a back room and killed them. The children's bodies were never found, but later on there were complaints at Freddy Fazbear's about an odor coming from these suits, even mentioning blood and mucus being evident around the eyes and mouths of the animatronics. So yeah, basically the murderer had killed and stuffed 5 children's bodies into the animatronic suits. That's it! That's the plot of Five Nights at Freddy's. But no, obviously that's not it, because with each game there was more opportunity to add on to that lore and story. Sometimes adding precious details like how the children were able to use their animatronic afterlife in order to seek revenge. And sometimes introducing a time-traveling ball pit. At first, the additions to the lore were welcome. Learning about how the marionette wanted to give the gift of life to others that suffered just like her added interest and intrigue to these characters that the fans already wanted to know more about. As the games went on though, and more was added, it started becoming very clear that the story was getting much bigger than Scott had ever intended. He kept adding without always making sure that everything lined up. Eventually, the mystery stopped being fun to solve. It felt like every game was just a fight between Scott and the audience about what was and wasn't true. The perfect symbol of this for me is the box at the end of the 4th game. Originally, there were a million theories about what was in that box.
What's in the box?
But eventually, Scott just denied us an answer. On one hand, I kind of respect it. But on the other, it is infuriating. Part of the success of this series was the mystery, the absolute necessity of watching every game theory drop after a new game, and then subsequently realizing that none of it matters when the next game drops. Still, you watch the theories. You check the Scott Games website for new images to dissect, because the mystery is supposed to be fun to solve. There are a plethora of YouTubers that have Fnaf to thank for their careers, and Fnaf has to thank YouTubers for a lot of its success. It's an Ouroboros of views and attention, a self-sustaining ecosystem. It's honestly pretty incredible. And eventually it became too much. The original series was supposed to end after 6 games. Five Nights at Freddy's Pizzeria Simulator was the perfect end to the series and to the monsters responsible for it all. Justice gets served and the souls of the children finally get to be free.
Although for one of you, the darkest pit of hell has opened to swallow you whole. So don't keep the devil waiting, friend.
That monologue genuinely gave me chills. Here's my understanding of the simplified lore up to this point. And by simplified, I mean very, very simplified. William Afton was the founder of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. He opened up the restaurant and worked there, wearing the suit of a yellow rabbit. Using the costume, he lured children into the back of the pizzeria and killed them, stuffing their bodies into suits. But William also had his own children, 3 little ones. The youngest, potentially named Evan, is better known as the crying child. While terrified of his father's creations having nightmares of them, he is essentially essentially forced to be around them. Michael, the oldest Afton sibling, makes fun of his brother for this fear, eventually teasing him by putting his head between the jaws of Golden Freddy. His crying added moisture to the spring locks that helped keep the suit in place around the endoskeleton. This moisture causes the spring locks to snap, resulting in the golden bear chomping down on his head. Tragedy seemed to follow the Fazbear chain of restaurants. Missing children, dead children, and a revolving door of security guards meant that William had to do his best to keep suspicion low. But eventually, his reign of terror caught up to him. One child, potentially named Charlotte or Charlie, became known as the Puppet, and she rallied the rest of the children to fight back, forcing Afton himself into the very rabbit suit he wore to lure the children away. Once in the suit, the spring lock snapped, slowly draining the life from William. But the story doesn't end there. Through sheer determination, William took over the suit. Michael, the brother from before, had grown up and wanted to avenge not just his little brother, but all the children whose death his father was responsible for. So he took night guard jobs under different aliases, looking for his father to eventually lure him into a trap. Pizzeria Simulator shows us that trap, luring not only William himself, but all of the animatronics who had spirits trapped in them. The building purposefully left out a safe way to exit in the event of a fire. So on the final night, the restaurant burns down, taking William and Michael with it, at last freeing those who deserve it and ending one man's serial murders. Yeah, there was also a sister, probably named Elizabeth, and a wife who both ended up being like freaky circus animatronics, but we really don't have time for all of that. Yell at me in the comments all you want, I'm sure I'm gonna have a lot of stuff wrong anyway. At this point in the series, there were a few plot holes, a few open-ended questions, a lot of people thinking that they knew all the answers. To me, this was the peak of listening to other people's theories. It felt like we had all the pieces, we just had to fit them together somehow. Different interpretations of the minigames and the story elements allowed for a variety of understandings of the game. Scott probably could have stopped before Pizzeria Sim. At this point, it still felt like he wanted to wrap up the story in a nice way. As I imagine you already know, the story doesn't wrap up there. In order to clarify the lore, Scott began publishing books. A lot of books. At first, it was widely accepted that the games and the books were two completely different universes. However, that line has become a lot blurrier over time. In a way, mimicking the lore of the games itself. Oh my god, don't get me started on the mimic. The story may have been satisfying, but there comes a greed with this level of success, both on the fandom's part and on Scott's. Another Fnaf game was bound to do well, no matter how poorly it was done. I haven't mentioned Fnaf World up until now because that is an entirely different mess that actually came out like almost a year before Pizzeria Sim, but I think it's fair to say that it was a disaster of a game, and I don't think most people would have minded if I just skipped over it entirely. Anyway, if another game was bound to be successful and the fans still seemed to care, of course the next game was inevitable. Though each new game could have just been world building, theory crafters never would have been satisfied with that. A new game meant new lore, and to be blunt, it meant more content, no matter how derivative. Its fame was its downfall. Five Nights at Freddy's simply became way too big. The lore became even more complicated, retconning simple things and asking even more questions to later be answered in a different sequel or a book or hell, even a movie or two. Not only was the lore too much, but the franchise was outgrowing itself faster than it could handle. Then Scott sold the franchise and a new era of FNAF began under the name Steel Wool. While I do think that this decision was the best that Scott could have made, I also think that there may have been some selfish motivations behind it. When it comes to FNAF and its influence, you cannot ignore the name Scott Cawthon, and there's a reason for that. When a franchise gets this big, there's a lot of money circulating around. People end up curious about where that money ends up. And a lot of fans weren't exactly happy about how Scott was using his profits, most abundantly in his political fundings. Now, Scott has never been shy about his Christian background. In fact, many of his earlier games leaned into religious themes. Games like The Pilgrim's Progress and The Desolate Hope included religious figures and were targeted at a Christian audience. While generally well received, they didn't find a lot of financial success. So, Scott tried to pivot and he created Chipper and Sons, who you may recognize as this enemy from FNAF World. Promise not to bring up FNAF World again. The criticism of Chipper and Sons leaned into the fact that the mascot characters were creepy and off-putting. And eventually, Scott took that and turned it into the secular game franchise that we all know and feel indifferent about. That leads us back to this full circle moment. The audience discovering how their support of the Five Nights at Freddy's series was unintentionally supporting certain politicians, most of whom I think I can safely say would not be approved by the fandom. YouTube isn't exactly a conservative website, and the Let's Play community even less so. As a reminder, this isn't just about the profits from the games themselves, but also the merchandise and so much more. Scott has since spoken up about why he chose to support these different politicians in their campaigns, but it does end up being hard to overlook how some of them oppose same same-sex marriage and other pursuits of equal rights. And obviously the support of certain people like Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump is, let's move on. Different politics is one thing, and it's also important to note that Scott has also donated a lot of money to different charities and more liberal organizations. For example, giving $500,000 to St. Jude's Children's Hospital during a GT Live Giving Tuesday livestream. The context of both sides of this arrangement tended to leave a bad taste in the audience's mouth. So is there a way to support FNAF without supporting the American Republican Party? It's a little late for that at this point, but Scott did end up selling the franchise to Steel Wool. Obviously, Scott still benefits, but take this as a reminder that it's not that simple to separate art from artist. Where you put your money ends up kind of being a gamble, and you should do your own research about what you want to financially support. Lucky for me, I can't play horror games because the second I get jump scared, I will quit. So I almost exclusively interact with the FNAF community through videos on YouTube, which are technically free and don't directly financially support Scott Cawthon. Okay, enough about Scott Cawthon. What about Steel Wool? I'd say that the FNAF game that Steel Wool gets the most recognition for is the massive open world style game called Security Breach. This game was very hyped as a huge step for the franchise, but when it came out, well, it had a few bugs. Okay, maybe a lot of bugs. Story-wise, there were some interesting choices, like Princess Quest, which I actually think is really fun and interesting. Then there's also multiple endings that for some reason were represented with comic strips. Up to this point, we have never associated FNAF with comics, barring, I guess, the graphic novel adaptations of the books, which, yes, by the way, exist. Maybe Steel Wool ran out of money to animate the endings? Or maybe they were lazy, or maybe, and this is my true belief, there were just too many cooks in the kitchen. More games means more lore, means more YouTube interaction, which means more demand, means more money, and more and more and more. Not only are there too many people trying to explain the story behind the scenes, they also just have far too much to work with of games that are already published. Just try to look at some of the non-game media. The movies are inspired by the original games, but also slightly inspired by the books, but like not really, only parts of it. Like using the drawings to communicate with the souls of the children in the animatronics. Now there's also spin-off games like Into the Pit, which lean more into the books and more into that same goddamn time-traveling ball pit. When there is a ton of already existing story ideas that can be turned into games, of course you're gonna go back to those. At least Into the Pit was pretty solidly separated from the rest of the franchise, unlike Secret of the Mimic. All in all, it was actually a pretty cool game, but my point still stands. It would be so much easier to enjoy the new games if we just accepted old game lore and new game lore as completely separate entities. Perhaps we could start the lore over in an alternate universe, but a ton of people who are already invested in the story that exists would probably be upset by that too. There really is no way of getting around that. The fanbase for Five Nights at Freddy's has definitely changed a lot over the years. I would say that calling it more critical would be an understatement. Considering how the franchise went from one solo developer to multiple movies starring Josh Hutcherson and Matthew Lillard of horror movie iconography. A bit more stern criticism might be deserved. The fandom has grown exponentially, and with that comes a lot of positive things, but also a lot of negatives. For instance, I think some of the newer fans may be unaware of the humble beginnings of Freddy Fazbear himself. Meanwhile, some of the long-term fans seem to have forgotten about those very same origins. Of course, there are things that everyone tends to forget over time, like the fact that liking things is supposed to be fun. When I first wrote the script for my original Context Kills video, my thesis was that something doesn't have to be good to be enjoyed. And I still believe that that's true. My favorite video game and the best video game I ever played are two very different experiences. Being aware of that distinction is how we're meant to navigate the world and its plentiful media. So is it cringe to still enjoy Five Nights at Freddy's in 2026? Yeah, obviously. Especially if your favorite character is some kind of Balloon Boy variant. I have no respect for you. But hey, at least you're still having fun. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I tried to do something a little bit different, but keep that Context Kills vibe. Definitely wanted to talk about Five Nights at Freddy's though, especially now that they're opening up an actual Five Nights at Freddy's location in New Jersey for some reason. Like, tell me why I'm kind of hyped. Maybe I'll go. Who knows? This video was a lot of fun to make, especially that cancan edit. Oh my god, I was cry laughing at it on my own. But anyway, please like the video, leave a comment, subscribe, you know, do all the things, ring the notification bell. Do people still do that? And I think that's about it. Now wait a second. August 8th, 2014. Let me just check something really quick. Okay, cool. So we have all of the FNAF games before GTA 6.